I'm going to attempt to make a sort of non-esoteric uh, survey of at least my latest confections of reducing identity politics into tangible terms, in terms of suggesting how to deal with it and confront it, um, perhaps as a primer for rhetorical exchanges and such between proponents of identity politics. Um, I do see this as the greatest sort of issue that is merely echoed and repeated in um, differing arenas with much the same substance, with just slightly different foils and yeah. So I'm going to talk about South African politics probably to some extent as well, just to try and make it incredibly pertinent. I guess let me just start with broad strokes then, I guess. The the fundamental presumption of identity politics is that uh, people are foremost um, uh, identity is derived by group categorization or some kind of collective experience or something like that. And so the supposed strength of identity politics is that you don't have to clearly uh, deal with reality in any sort of precise way. That there's sort of this built-in statistical generalization, which just can be used uh, as a kind of as a shortcut, as an expedient sort of non-think uh, crude answer to a problem or something like that. So it can be deployed without thinking in some sense. Um, it has built in automatic sort of arguments and circuitry based on its premise. And the biggest challenge is that in some technical respect, it does treat the issues that it pretends to tackle honestly. It does. It can, in some fuzzy logic way, it does uh, deal with what it promises. In some sense, the problem is that it deals with it in such an unintelligent way that it ends up reproducing its own complaint. In some sense, it ends up proving itself right by needing to depend on it even more in some sense because it has these sort of built-in conflations and such within its thinking. Okay, let me try and map that out meticulously. After sort of heading that, all of that, putting all of that as my title. Um, so basically, the strength of identity politics is that it's based on statistics and generalization. And so, because it makes true statements in the sense that they are generalizations, they're generally true. And then the idea is that, well, because the problem is structural, because the problem manifests on a structural level, which has these statistical correlation, the problem is that we need to merely change the statistic. We need to treat the statistic as the problem. So it's like the problem is the statistic. The solution is to directly manhandle the statistic, is to directly change the statistic. And as soon as you do that, you've basically given up the rule of law, you've given up everything. You've generated enough ideological corruption that you can conceal and contrive any number of things that will never be picked up by the radar. You've created a moral landscape that is so devoid and hollow because it's just filled by this quite disgusting racialist rhetoric in which everyone is just merely a token for their general statistic. And so, you know, that's the problem, is that a kind of a meritocracy, or having any kind of merit-based decision making or something like that, it just goes out the window. It can't operate because there's just no oxygen for it. It's already taken up by all of this machinery that operates sort of so automatically and ideologically. And the only way to sort of desensitize yourself to that level of corruption is simply to double down on the identity politics aspect, and to double down on the generalized narrative of everyone is just a token of their collective entity, and they are just a piece of their collective experience and such. And you know, there's a lot of weird, almost occult type things built into this kind of fatalistic thinking, where you have this fatalistic narrative where everyone has a shared destiny because they share an identity. It really does have this inbuilt dehumanization, you know, sort of thing. And then it's ironic because a lot of the rhetoric that they generate is around dehumanization, but yet they are essentially enforcing not only a sort of dehumanization of themselves, in which they are basically reducing themselves to a kind of insect colony, that they are a hive entity, and that the kind of the vicarious prestige of some of the members rub off on all the rest of them, or something like that. And it has this sort of built-in fascistic, you know, sort of pedigree that you know, people are doing things for the shared identity. And so you end up with this lavishly rich and wealthy identity, even if it is destroying people on the ground, and it's destroying the functioning of a liberal democratic society, and it's destroying the functioning of an economy to cater to these decadent identity politics values of superficial equality according to identity. Is that to ensure the equality of identity, you have to literally destroy any kind of discerning that you have, any kind of individual merit or anything like that. It has to go all the way, you know, essentially you have to import some kind of historical collective punishment as the justification for overlooking all these things that exist in present time. So it's like, you know, you really have to see everything as a token of history, and we can never actually deal with problems as they persist in the present. That everything has to have this kind of historical guilt attached to it. And sadly, even when that runs out, because there's just at no point does it ever take on its shoulders the kind of autonomous accountability of an individual, because it can just always just try to excavate that missing you know, well, the reason why we can't be individuals is because of this toxic history, so that they have to keep on projecting the history onto the present. So just to keep on doubling down and to keep the train moving forward. And, you know, it gets more and more hysterical, more and more, you know, racially paranoid and such, because the more that this kind of policy sabotages the economy, the more that the only solution that they have is to blame history even more. And so, you know, you get more and more dislocated from any sense of accountability, which never gets rehabilitated according to this program. It's like, in this way, it is like a false prophet, is because by the destruction that following this false prophet produces, it proves its own self-righteousness somehow. And so the more right it is, the more you need to depend on it, and the more impoverished the situation becomes. So it's got this sort of inbuilt thing. Anyway, the way to really confront this sort of thinking, because it's so insulated in its own thinking, it's so it lashes out almost blindly. It has this sort of blind faith built into it. The only way to sort of combat it is you have to employ a kind of an art of giving offense. You have to give offense to the proponents of this ideological corruption. And it's not even so much as that how you offend them. It must be principally justifiable in some sense. You have to have greater themes. I feel that Helen Ziller would have been much more effective if there was a broader principled theme that the whole organization was somewhat anti-identity politics, and so that she had a greater sort of theme to fall back on and to say, well, look, I'm holding the line in this instance because you're forcing me to generate these counter attacks or something like that against your specious accusations. You're forcing me to sort of generate these substantiations. But I mean, the problem is that's a very sort of caged, that's a fight of their choosing, and sort of following those threads of sadly, when people are making it about group dignity or group pride or something like that, as this narrative of group pride. I mean, sadly, that is right at the crux of the identity politics problem, is that when a proponent of identity, if you want to push back directly against a proponent of identity politics, you have to transcend them. You have to sort of take the moral high ground. It's the only way to go about it. If you want to push back on them in terms that they already sort of accept, essentially you have to adopt their own thinking, which is exactly what they want. They want a proliferation of their fascistic values. So it's very difficult to actually deal with them on their terms. You can't deal with them on their terms. You have to deal with them on a higher principle, and you have to distinguish that your principles and your morality is essentially vastly different from theirs, because you take these issues on as a non-racialist thinker, and they are proposing their issues as they believe that the essential thing that makes people what they are is a racialist. They exist in a racialist reality, and they won't take responsibility for adopting this schema. Their big excuse is that, oh well, it was foisted onto them by history, so they are just sort of continuing the chain of their reactionary bullshit or something like that. It was done to them first or something like that. Perhaps they wouldn't line up their excuse like that, but anyway, that is effectively what the scenario is. And they will depend on that sort of victim status as why it is rightful for them to contend a defense of their identity. So it's interesting, because it is the weakness of the identity that is their kind of collective hurt, and their justification for therefore making the rehabilitation of the identity and the redemption of the pride in that identity as the first task of their policy, or the first task of their political movement or something like that, which is obviously inherently racialist in its presumption. That is the axiom that it is proceeding from. I'm sort of discussing these things as technical as I can, just sort of surveying some of these issues. But so the way to confront this would be to, I mean, I would say you have to reduce their position. You have to just say this is what they are doing. You have to say this is what they are saying. This is their position. You have to encapsulate their position and pin it to them. You don't have to make them admit to it, but you have to say this is what their position. You have to claim that you know what their position is, and you have to make a statement as to what their position is, and then have them attack you for it. Or if they don't want to attack you for it, then just keep on saying it about them. And so that is how you dismiss them, is you say, well, they are racialist. You probably want a more contextually specific kind of thing in terms of the gist of what their actual rhetoric is. You would say that, well, this is their position. And so you don't essentially malign them. You just basically reduce their position into a moral language, and you show them up for what they are in some sense. So you unmask them in that sense, and either they attack you for it or they won't. They probably will attack you for it, or they'll probably try to undermine the thing that you say about them, which perhaps they'll take offense to, or something like that. And maybe you will slightly because you see, you can't also track how these things are going to go. You don't know how they're going to react to it. You don't know how they're going to respond to it. But I would say that you do this with a certain kind of humility, that if you maybe phrased something, depending on how they're going to continue, because it's going to get recontextualized depending on whatever discourse comes out afterwards, about the statement that you made about them, about the EFF, for instance. That's what, when I say them, I mean specifically the EFF, because although there are murmurings of this stuff within the ANC, they're sort of they're kind of internal in some sense. Although obviously there's a large section of the ANC that is essentially spiritually aligned with the EFF, if not in terms of their personnel or politically, but in terms of their policy and their sentiment. So my point would be that be willing to recontextualize your initial statement by even saying, okay, well, maybe that was a bit off. Maybe that was a bit off color. Maybe that was said a bit too harshly. And based on what you're saying now, which sounds a bit different to how you sometimes speak, because sometimes you seem to speak with a forked tongue. Sometimes you say this and then you say that, and you seem to be inconsistent in your rhetoric. But since you say that, then I'll be willing to amend my initial statement. But the point is not to save the statement. The point is to save the principle behind the statement, and to essentially force them to measure up to that principle and how they're not reaching it or how they're falling short of it. And it's obviously, this sort of principle doesn't really make much difference to the political scene unless you literally link the lack of the principle to the corruption. That because we have lost a non-racialist ethos, we have let the door open for corruption. That the ideological corruption is inextricably linked with the state corruption. And that essentially Mandela's vision has been betrayed. And you say, well, obviously with the opposition party, also because during the government of national unity, Mandela asked us to be the opposition party. They asked us not to join the government of national unity because he wanted us to be his opposition, because he knew that the country needed an honest opposition, and he chose us. Make yourself part of the history, which the DP, the DA essentially was. And we would love to not have to invoke Mandela, but when he has been betrayed by his own former party, at some point, you have to sort of allude that Mandela would have not been loyal to what the ANC is today. and I think that is directly pertinent to to let's just say the factual position on the ground in terms of the real politic. The problem is that people feel loyal to the ANC because it was the party of liberation. And Mandela is part of, obviously, the liberation story. Of course, he's part of it. He's a central player in that. And so, of course, we're going to have to talk about Mandela, especially when he has been betrayed by this party. I mean, he is talked badly about by members of this party. He is under his vision is undermined patently. His moral ethos, by this racialist scum that has infested our political situation, that buttresses the corruption, the state corruption, essentially, by concealing it from public view under this fog of war and this confusion, because there's no political leadership that is willing to sort of fill this moral authority vacuum that has been left. And and because not only do you need a kind of dissenting rhetoric that is truly accusatory, you do need to say something. You do, you do need to make stark claims against, and I would also make a rhetorical point of even not attacking the ANC. I would attack the EFF and almost call the ANC a subsidiary of that is a kind of, it's a weird fence sitter but it's hoping to profit from the kind of toxic politics that the EFF promulgates. I would even call the EFF the cancer of the country and the source of the I mean, they were so toxic that they were even thrown out of the EFF. The EFF Julius Malema was thrown out of the ANC. That it was at this. I mean, we can also use the history of the ANC itself. I mean, Thabo Mbeki essentially tried to oust Jacob Zuma. He didn't want him to become the next president. And I mean, Thabo Mbeki was taken out because sadly, he did it at a time where he himself was open to attack. I mean, if we didn't have the TAC, the Treatment Action Campaign, at the time that it manifested, we might be living in a very different South Africa if Thabo Mbeki had the power to properly, the ANC that got rid of Thabo Mbeki because Thabo Mbeki was monitoring some of these internal things, and that was really a watershed moment anyway. But there has been this black nationalistic faction within the ANC, which Mandela knew was dangerous because he knew the kind of corruption that it brought, essentially. And obviously, we don't have a president that is strong enough to basically eradicate. I mean, essentially, the problem is that it's not that the ANC is corrupt; it's that the corruption is the ANC. The corruption. So it's not as if you can just get rid of the corrupt element of the ANC. Is that there's nothing worth saving in some sense, So it's just this kind of this hollow container of an internal power contention, and I mean, essentially what the ANC is really grappling with is, can they get Jacob Zuma back as a president? I mean, this is how patently sort of delusional and insane the internal politics of the ANC is. It's beyond, it's a circus at this point. I mean, it's sort of the reason why we are a failing state is because of the ANC. It's obvious, the writing's on the wall. And if we track that decadent decline, we can say ideologically what the cause is. We can say it's identity politics. We can say that it doesn't matter what rhetoric you have about corruption. if you're going to have the kind of policy that we have, of course there's going to be looting, because in the quota system, which is obviously sabotaging small and medium enterprises and such, and you know, all we can do is generate more and more identity consciousness to sort of satiate this. I mean, in some sense, you can even say that the ANC has decided not to develop the country, because then they wouldn't have any promises to make about educating people, or bringing them a better life. Like if you actually provide a better life for people, then the power base of the ANC somewhat degrades, because people will choose based on, you know, calibrating who can be a more effective governing party. But if they can sort of keep people suppressed, then they still have something to grope towards, or something like that. And so then they can sort of endlessly sell this kind of this false hope. It's like almost like a confidence game. And at the point at which uh, people can see that they look corrupt, or that people are being made rich, but it's not sort of helping the common man, they just sort of divert with racial tension and statistics. I mean, I think if you honestly looked at statistics, you would just sort of perhaps fathom that everyone has been doing badly in this country, because we have an unaccountable political class. And I mean, we also have a lot of destabilizing social factors as well, that have to do with essentially bad actors that are acting unconstitutionally. And I mean this in terms of people who make consistent assaults against foundational constitutional values, like Eusebius McKaiser, who will say disgusting things on public radio. These are people who should be in jail. Julius Malema is someone who should be in jail. I mean, these are people who are patently fascists, and they get away with it simply because they can say, well, these are the times that we live in. This is what's taught in gender and race studies at university, which are essentially no different than the Aryan studies of Weimar Germany. I mean, this is the kind that there has been no attempt to clean up these disgusting actors that are essentially vectors of hate speech and an ideological racialism, which is certainly unconstitutional. There are moral standards in the Constitution about non-racialism, and you don't get to bypass them because you say that, oh no, we're hypothetically allowed to explore whatever science we so wish in terms of the social sciences. I mean, the thin intellectual, sort of edifice that they're using to justify this. I mean, it's uh, sadly, we do need more of a cultural war, but also a legal manifestation of standards that sort of start to clean up. I mean, otherwise, there's going to be no hope. The destabilization is just going to I mean, already they have tried. I mean, they are literally following Mein Kampf to a T. I mean, there is no difference in strategy. If we didn't have the water crisis, and if we didn't have Obama giving his speech, I think already we might have already had quite a bad outcome. They have done it before now, where they have concertedly with I don't know, these journalists. They must have some sort of secret meeting somewhere where they coordinate certain kinds of propaganda, because I mean they have been, just as they did in Weimar Germany and Nazi Germany, where they kind of create these waves of I can go into the psychology of it, but this would not be the kind of analysis that you use. But basically, the kind of there was a psychologist, an Italian psychologist. What's his name? Starts with a Z. Luigi Zoja. Luigi Zoja had this idea about the socially successful paranoid, essentially as anyway. That is what essentially Hitler was. Is that he he was a kind of a paranoid person, but because he was able to sort of infuse it into an ideological edifice and become successful in his society, that essentially the whole society becomes this kind of pathological complex of paranoia, but which obviously has to be which has its own sort of ideological built-in furnace that you have to keep feeding with fuel in some sense, and eventually, you kind of turn into a kind of human sacrifice machine, like the Aztecs or something like that, where you have to find some human sacrifice to keep the internal value in focus. Okay, that's a bit of a strange tangent, perhaps, but what's actually happening, I would say, is that this is hard to follow because it's very semantically precise. It has to do with envy and jealousy, and so what the Führer principle essentially is kind of doing for the society is, and I've often described it, between someone who is like a, okay, I'm not gonna. That's gonna be a mixed metaphor. To sort of, I won't talk about that. But basically, the ideology is trying to conflate two separate human passions in some sense, and so the passion of envy and the passion of jealousy. Now, jealousy comes often. Jealousy actually means is that you fear to lose something that belongs to you, and envy is that you wish to have something that belongs to somebody else. So jealousy kind of has built within it a preemptive kind of privilege or position of power, and envy is sort of a disempowered kind of state of being, obviously. Now, so someone so basically what is kind of happening in terms of this is like, I would rather get into this psychologically in a much more delineated way, but this is a really condensed summary, so it's not that useful. But basically, they are trying to convert the envy that exists in individuals and sell those individuals. Your envy is actually a mark of virtue because it is a sign of a crime that has been done against our group, which has had its jealousy um, uh, what's the word that means that a crime against something, violated, that there have been acts of violation against our jealousy. And so it basically tries to create a permission that envy is a mark of virtue. And the problem is that it is fundamentally unstable. And so because you're saying that you should actually as an individual be envious, but that is a symbolic representation of what has been stolen from the group. And as soon as you've got this complex set up, there is no escape in some sense, because uh, you have to keep on feeding that narrative. You have to keep on promulgating that narrative, and you can see that this is why there's such a conformist kind of orthodoxy, that journalists are expected and to cater to this particular sentiment, this particular thirst and hunger for keeping that very fragile dynamic valid. And this is the problem: is that if you think that is the correct ideology to hold, you literally have to warp everything into serving that dynamic. It becomes Everything becomes just about that, just keeping the ideology valid. And that's problematic in itself, because that means you can't even rationally understand problems and look for solutions, because that prime ideological constraint becomes an endless servitude, essentially. And so this is why, fascists and people that hold fascistic values, they need a bit of respite from their own thing, which is why, there's always such a great pretense towards some kind of greater religious thing. This is why Julius Malema will sometimes act in this very sort of pious way, and being this humble representative of God's justice or some shit like that. The kind of, because he has to represent a kind of this moral authority that is lacking in the system, and that only his paternalism can provide. The kind, and the paternalism that corresponds with an infantilism, which is marked by its envy, and then that envy is conflated into the crime against the group's jealousy. And Jordan Peterson has kind of alluded to this. He talks about that, that people do bear a kind. He feels, because he didn't articulate it as I have just given some articulation to it, that these people are being fueled by resentment, and that they do seem to bear some accountability for that. That they know that they're involved in some kind of dynamic. I think that's as close as Jordan Peterson has come to sort of describing that. But yeah, so. And then an ancillary point to all of this is that also this means that people aren't allowed to represent themselves as anything other than, as an aspect in the identity matrix. So everyone has to at least conform or give some lip service. You have to be able to extract people giving lip service to their privilege or their identity, that everyone has to sort of have their identity card according to this this grand moral narrative. So it does, for it to exist at all, it's an all or nothing sort of thing. It's a, so it has this kind of built-in totalitarian aspect to it. And sadly, it can be so because it will often attack anything that is trying to represent a kind of a non-racial mentality. It will go out of its way only to sort of accuse and offend people who, so it's like they don't mind so much people who already have a kind of uh, that already are invested in some version of identity politics. I mean, they will complain about what they term the far right or something like that, but actually, they want, they're actually quite happy with people being that way because it's the best propaganda for their identity consciousness. Um, it's the sort of it's the best excuse. I mean, a lot of this stuff actually came into our culture through the gay rights kind of movement and through feminism, primarily feminism, but also the gay rights movement, which anyway, seem to remember also that there was a big aspect of that in the TAC that brought on Thabo Mbeki. But anyway, the Oh yeah, so I was just going to point out that, for instance, in the Me Too movement, it was pointed out to me, and I had a discussion about it, that the people who are attacked in the Me Too movement are people who are effectively, they don't identify as having an identity, essentially, according to identity politics. So it's like and this was pointed out to me that in the Me Too movement, no one attacks R. Kelly or something like that. I mean, I don't really know all the detail. I don't even know if that's actually true or not. But they said that, basically if someone has, and I made this counterpoint. I said, I don't think this has anything to do with race. I think this just has to do with identity politics. And, but anyway, and so it really offends them to they attack people who are antithetical to identity politics. That is their primary target. Is they want to destroy the notion of non-racialism, essentially, and its principles. They want to degrade them. They want to undermine them, and they do this. And it is unconstitutional. It is illegal. And we have public money going into this at universities. I mean, it's very disgusting. And even the people that promulgate this stuff. I mean, the lecturers themselves. I mean, these are people that really should be in jail. I mean, these. Yeah, I mean, people say, "Oh, it's sad that you want them to lose their jobs." No, I don't want them to lose their jobs. I want them to be in jail. I mean, these are like Nazi sympathizers, and I mean that. I really do mean that. And I don't care if they think that, oh, well, I'm Jewish, so I can't be effectively, categorized in this way. I mean, what a baseless fucking defense, that you're going to use your fucking identity to sort of defend yourself from being essentially a racialist bigot at its core, and you sort of, black people you can't be a bigot if you're just anti-white. You can't be a racist if you have the skin color. I mean, it's patently absurd. It is so backward, and you know, I'm yeah. Uh, Sadly, you can't really debate these sorts of people. You can't debate fascists, essentially. It's not going to work out. Um, I mean, because essentially the problem is just in their in their chosen set of axioms. They have already bought into the identity matrix. They already believe that people have a collective experience, that they somewhat have a collective destiny. That's already baked into it. And the kind of state that I mean, sadly, I mean, there's a very negative line of rhetoric that you could take against this general sort of cultural edifice, which is that well, uh, I mean, I don't think it's even valid to make the argument that I was about to make, because we haven't really had the leadership the kind of the political vision. No one has represented the moral vacuum that has been left in South African politics. And so, I do think that if people were, if there was a proactive enough representation of of a coherent vision that is being the torchbearer for Mandela, I do think that that is the only viable course to take. And maybe if history is going to go badly, let us at least say that the right principle, was brought to bear at the time at which it was certainly applicable and needed and missing. So I do think that it should first be a sort of a principled ethos that undergirds policy debate, but that the principle must actually be the first shot fired, in that you must attack people for having bad principles, betrayed the new South Africa, and such. I think we need that kind of rhetoric, and I think that we should then, when other people try to mimic that rhetoric or try to undermine that rhetoric, well, then you can characterize them in the way that they need to be characterized. I mean, Julius Malema has said things that are patently false in Parliament. He said that we live in a parliamentary democracy. We do not live in a parliamentary democracy. We live in a constitutional democracy. Parliament is not sovereign. The Constitution is sovereign. The level of deceit that is needed to sort of promulgate and to concoct the kind of legal positivism that fascists need to infest a society with their vacuous and superficial field marshalling that can whip people up in these sorts of mob justice groupthinks that lead them where. Sadly, you can only really show that up when you've got a cohesive, principled, themed sort of alternative. So I do think that the new South Africa has to be salvaged by those who have betrayed it. I think that needs to be somewhat the undergirding theme of the official opposition. It needs to be saved by those who have sabotaged it. And that sabotage must first be identified as a moral lacking, and then as either the non-application of certain principles which substantiate the claim of the moral lacking that one is pointedly making as a contention, and then as an afterthought you mention the policy alternative, and then after, because you've made the right priority in the right chain, when people want to cast bad intentions and bad faith, and they want to make aspersions against your policy, then you point out how their policy is delivering badly on the principles and is the corruption, and your policy, actually perhaps requires some faith in private actors acting for the good of the country, and the idea that only when government is involved and has the primary influence over events, that somehow then good things happen. Oh, well, I think we've had some years of that now. And simply just changing the amount of radicalness involved in the same bad policy that undermines the framing the framing architecture that the society was supposed to deliver on in terms of yeah, I mean, look, there are some other, let's say, leftover contentious issues. Like, for example, I would say that there is a fundamental problem with the Freedom Charter. You know, people that bring up historically the Freedom Charter. I mean, the Freedom Charter is fundamentally an unworkable document. I mean, you could never base a constitution around it. I mean, it's sort of what would it even be? I mean, a sort of pie of the sky. There will be a mountain of gold that appears in front of me. You know, like you could write that into a freedom charter. It doesn't mean anything. You know, it sort of is not worth. I mean, how it's being relied on by so-called revolutionaries. You know, is obviously destructive and toxic and stuff like that. But you know, obviously it has a kind of historical significance and such. But we really have to recognize that the Constitution is far better than the Freedom Charter ever was, and it really does supplant it. And we must forget about the Freedom Charter, and we must look at the Constitution, which can be delivered upon. It requires it requires an intelligent government, effectively. Government done in an intelligent way. But I mean, to talk about intelligence, I mean, because it's not intelligence, it's not the lack of intelligence in some sense. Well, I mean, the use of intelligence for the purposes of good governance is what we lack. But I mean, the reason why we don't have that is not because there aren't clever people in this country. It's because essentially of the nature of corruption and the nature of ideological corruption. So these are the kinds of I think it's important to separate, you know, and disambiguate, you know, all the various ways in which the kind of the propaganda of the demagogue can be you know, and I would, you know, if people want to give short and sharp aspersions after you've made the right principal claims and things like that, people want to sort of give junk, you know, sort of refutations, then you basically just say, well, you know, that you didn't really raise a contention. You just basically swore out loud. I mean, I would like to swear back at you, but, you know, I have better things to do with my time, and you're obviously not a credible political force. You're just a force for you know, I've probably in my other videos, in my other recordings, I've come up with sort of better phrases and things like that. But I mean, essentially, you know, they're sort of like hate mongers in some sense. You know, they are identity racketeering. You know, and that's all that they're capable of doing, because obviously they don't understand the issues, they don't understand the problems, they just understand identity, because that's the shortcut in life. You just understand something about identity and everything else will fall in line, because you can just sort of promulgate and make policy about identity rather than on the underlying challenges and the real challenges. You can just sort of whine about identity and history and end up repeating all the mistakes of history in so doing. Anyway, I guess this has been long enough.